Hello there, welcome to another Fireside Chat. I'm John Barrett.
And I'm Jan6th.
This week, the Kennedys, conspiracies, COVID, and what might have been.
We've got two great guests for you today, Nick Bryant and Bob Shrum. And we've got some malarkey to bust as well.
Kennedy-themed malarkey, no less, Chaz. But first, this week, to the decision by the new House Speaker, Mike Johnson, to order the release of literally tens of thousands of hours of footage from the January 6th, 2021 attack on the US Capitol building. It may or may not have been an honest attempt at transparency. It was certainly an honest attempt at getting elected Speaker because a bunch of Conservatives made it contingent on their votes. Release the tapes, Mike. But it is already providing plenty of fodder for misinformation and some very selective editing. So what do you think, Chaz, on balance? Was this a bad news from Speaker Mike?
Well, I mean, this is history, right? This is the January 6th was probably the biggest historical event of the last, 5 years, 10 years?
Probably.
It's big, right? So I think it's good to get it out there and for people to have access. It's not like it's on everyone's internet. They are blurring faces. They're making moves to try and reduce security implications and all the rest of it. So that's good. And I think it's good to get it out there. But as you say, there's so much bad faith. There really is. And until now, the only people who had access to that footage, other than people with classifications, was Tucker Carlson.
Bizarrely enough.
Yeah.
On Wednesday night's Planet America, you gave one of the first examples where, some politicians ended up with egg on their face because they bought into conspiracy theories that were being peddled online from grainy images that had been released. And it seems as though, there's just infinite scope now, with 44,000 hours to be released. In total, about 95% of all footage is going to be released.
Yeah.
They're holding some back for security reasons, which means the conspiracy theorists are not going to be assuaged. They'll say, the really good stuff that proves it's an inside job, that's the stuff they're not releasing. So this other stuff, they're still turning it into crazy conspiracy theories anyway.
Absolutely. Although, as I said, Kevin McCarthy already gave the footage to Tucker Carlson. He'd already started doing this. Now, everyone can do it. And look, you're right, we're already seeing examples of this. I've got another example I can play for you right there. And what you're seeing here is you're seeing someone who, we don't know. That's the thing, we're just seeing this footage out of nowhere.
Right.
But we're assuming this is a protester who was handcuffed. We're assuming that. We're assuming he's been unhandcuffed by security, and we're assuming that he then fist bumps a member of security. We don't know, but we're assuming that, and then people conclude, therefore that proves that guy's a Fed and the whole thing's rigged and everyone should be released from prison. But obviously, number one, not everyone was committing crimes.
Right.
On January 6th.
Yep.
Number two, those who were committing crimes weren't committing crimes 24 hours a day, like every single moment. If they're walking down a corridor, there'll be heaps of times when there are people walking down a corridor doing nothing and the police are relaxed, which we've seen heaps of footage of, by the way, on the internet. Lots of leaking of, look, the police didn't care. Well, they didn't care at that particular moment.
Right, there were high fives, they were welcome in.
They might have cared when they were getting their head bashed in some other place at another time, So they're taking these things out of context, doesn't prove anything, but these people are still going to try anyway.
So content without that context, without even knowing who these people are, what was going on here, you could argue that it's actually kind of reckless and irresponsible for all of this just to be dumped. It's kind of it's the deluge of honesty. It's like the never-ending press conference when somebody says, I have nothing to hide, ask me any questions all about my financial dealings and my mistresses, and ask me any question you like. Give them 44,000 hours of stuff and they'll just splash around in that for months.
But I also think, that's true, but I also think two things. First of which is, people aren't dumb. They know this.
What?
No, they're not. No, some people are dumb. Some people are dumb.
They are.
But my point is, on the internet, it takes two or three of these videos before people go, I see what's happening here. Right. And each successive video has less impact.
So you're saying that the hive mind will actually arrive at somewhere sensible, a consensus will form, and it won't just be the crazies running the narrative.
There will be crazies who are entertaining other crazies, but I think most people, after when the first video came out straight away, people went, oh my God, look at this. When the second video came out, people were like, oh yeah, we're up to about the 20th video now, and no one cares already. Right. And I think we've gotten to the point where the bite is lost out of this kind of stuff, unless they find something real. I think people are expecting, it's another one of those videos. And by contrast, there's another side to this as well. People assuming the only side that is mining these videos are the pro-January 6th side. But there's also what they call the sedition hunters, who have spent the last 3 years trying to find people to send to jail through crowdsourcing footage and Facebook videos and stuff, trying to find crimes they can then report to the FBI. They're going to be going through this footage as well. And I wonder if those guys find one or two things, because they've already found plenty, if they find one or two things that the police didn't find and someone ends up getting charged, I wonder how quickly they might regret that those videos have been released. But so there are two sides to this. But I do think in the end, when we skip forward 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, we're going to be glad that footage is out there, even if there was a splurge of conspiracy activity for a few months.
Glad because of the transparency of it, or because of what it will reveal?
Because the historical value of it.
Will it reveal the truth? Because most people, I mean, there are some people that believe that it was an inside job and that you know it wasn't nearly as bad as But most people, they saw it happen on January 6th. They know what happened.
There will always be people who have wacky conspiracy theories. But look, today we're talking about JFK. Don't you wish there was 44,000 hours of footage of JFK's assassination?
Yeah, well, there are 44,000 hours of documentaries made about the assassination of JFK, and I don't think they've gotten particularly close. But look, this week on Planet America and on the Fireside Chat, we are reflecting on the life and legacy of America's 35th President, John F. Kennedy, who was killed, of course, 60 years ago this week on November 22nd, 1963. It was in his inaugural address in January of 1961 that Kennedy, who was, of course, the first president born in the 20th century, he famously said that a torch had been passed to a new generation, and he issued this important call to service.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man.
President Kennedy inspired some to go into government and politics, others into fields like social work. For others still, he ignited an interest in American politics. But John F. Kennedy, of course, was not perfect, far from it, nor was his legacy. His presidency cut short, leaving some things undone and others hardly begun. Nick Bryant is a familiar face to many of you as a former BBC foreign correspondent. You may not also know, though, that he has a doctorate in American history, and among his books is The Bystander, John F. Kennedy and his struggle for black equality. Nick Bryant, welcome back to the Fireside Chat.
It is so lovely to be here. And John, let me commend you first of all on your outfit. You do look like a new frontiersman. You look like a member of the Kennedy administration in that sharp suit and that thin tie.
I was hoping for the sort of the Walter Cronkite glasses as well, but I couldn't quite swing it.
He certainly is a mad man, I'll tell you that.
OK. Now, this week, I'm sure you're both the same. I've been thinking a lot about John F. Kennedy and the Kennedy legacy. And I had in mind the eulogy that Teddy Kennedy gave for Robert Kennedy in 1968, when he said that, words to the effect that my brother need not be enlarged in death beyond what he was in life. And it had me thinking, Nick, that I feel as though we've probably done that for JFK, that he has been enlarged. Is that fair to say?
And that was very deliberate. Camelot, for instance, was never a term that was attached to the Kennedy presidency while he was alive. It was the invention of his widow, Jackie. In the weeks afterwards, she summoned a guy called Teddy White, who was the greatest chronicler of American politics at that time. He worked for Life magazine. She gave an interview with him, and very deliberately, she planted the idea in his head that JFK loved a very popular musical, a Broadway musical called Camelot, and in particular a song with the line, "One brief shining moment." Now, Teddy White actually phoned in his copy that night to Life magazine. His editor said, "That's too florid, that's too flowery." And he went back and talked about it with Jackie, but she said, "No, the Camelot stuff has to stay. And I want that one brief shining moment to stay as well." And in that moment, the Camelot myth was born. But as we all know, there was a darker side to Camelot as well.
It's interesting you're describing the manipulation of the media there as well, which I wouldn't have expected quite that much. But if you're saying there's a certain degree of mythology about the Kennedy legacy and Camelot, what would you say are the greatest myths about JFK?
Well, one of the great misconceptions about JFK is that he is this idealistic, crusading liberal. He wasn't that. He was very much a pragmatic centrist, somebody who read the politics and tried to act accordingly. The classic example of that is civil rights. I mean, many people still regard him as this great champion of the struggle for black equality. But on civil rights, he's really got a very mixed record. He downplayed civil rights in the early part of his presidency. When Martin Luther King wanted to hold the March on Washington in 1963, the Kennedy brothers actually pleaded him not to do it. The last thing they wanted was a huge crowd of African Americans descending on Washington, because at that time there was a real fear that there was a black rebellion underway in the South, and they feared a mass riot on the doorstep of the White House, and they also feared the besiegement of Capitol Hill. And when King refused and said, we're going to do it anyway, the Kennedys ordered the biggest military build-up in peacetime history to make sure it was policed. It's just one illustration of how things like that tend to get forgotten. And we tend to remember Kennedy for introducing a Civil Rights Act at the end of his presidency, which was far-reaching. But the reason he did that was not because of idealistic reasons. He really worried that a black rebellion was about to overwhelm his presidency.
Lyndon Johnson was the one, of course, who was the steward of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and many other things that had been sort of floated but not pushed too hard under Kennedy. Is it fair to say that possibly more was done in Kennedy's name than was done by Kennedy himself?
One of the brilliant things that Lyndon Johnson did after Kennedy's death was to say the best way to memorialise him is to pass this civil rights legislation. So something that Kennedy really hadn't pushed that strongly became the way for Johnson of actually saying this should be our tribute to Kennedy. And that was an irresistible argument in the aftermath of Kennedy's death. And of course, LBJ was this great legislative architect in a way that Kennedy wasn't. He'd been a congressman and a senator on Capitol Hill, but many congressmen and senators regarded Kennedy as a lightweight. He was 43 when he was elected. He's younger than all of us. And many of the sort of lions on Capitol Hill and some of the Southern segregationists who were Democrats at that time, they looked down on Kennedy. They bullied Kennedy in the early part of his presidency when he tried to get his legislative program through. And it did take LBJ to get those civil rights acts through. And they were the landmark acts. I mean, they were the acts that killed off Jim Crow in the South, segregation in the South. And they actually got the Voting Rights Act passed as well, which was universal suffrage in America for the first time, something which we often forget.
So if we wildly speculate with the counterfactual then, would you say that had JFK not been shot, civil rights would either have not happened in the next 5 years or would have happened in a completely different way?
Look, my view is always that Kennedy probably would have got a Civil Rights Act through. I don't think it may have been quite so strong as it was under Johnson, and I think that's the key. And I think one of the myths about Kennedy is there was this sort of great before and after, this idea that America really went into turmoil after his death. You know, you had further assassinations of his brother Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, you had the inner city race riots, you had the escalation of Vietnam, and none of these things would have happened if Kennedy had stayed alive. And maybe that's true, we don't know. But the key point to make is that on the morning that Kennedy was killed, America was an incredibly violent country. America was an incredibly divided country. America had all sorts of problems. In the 1950s, there had been the McCarthy era. Just weeks before Kennedy was killed, those 4 black schoolgirls in Birmingham, Alabama were killed when the KKK attacked a church in Birmingham, which had been the centre of Martin Luther King's protest movement. This idea that this was a kind of moment where America lost its innocence is nonsense.
We're talking in this program, Nick, a bit about various conspiracy theories, misinformation and so on. A lot of conspiracy theories around the Kennedy assassination. At the time of the assassination, already 50% of Americans told Gallup they thought there was more to it than what ultimately was concluded by the Warren Commission, that Lee Harvey Oswald was the one assassin and he acted alone. There was no wider conspiracy. Now that has gone from 50% to 65%. So 2/3 of American adults today believe something other than the official version of the story. What does that tell you as a barometer of sentiment, of trust in government, or something else entirely?
Well, if you look at the polling about trust in government in America, there's a real downward slide after the Warren Commission comes up with its report that there is this lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. And I think one of the problems with the Warren Commission and what was behind it was that I think very few people really wanted to find out what truly happened. I think LBJ, the president, he thought there might be a Cuban involvement and a Soviet involvement. And he didn't really want to highlight that because he feared the repercussions of that. That could lead to a nuclear war. Robert Kennedy thought the mafia were behind his brother's assassination. And again, he didn't want to press that too hard because that might have exposed some of the links between the Kennedy family and the mafia over the time. I mean, one of Kennedy's girlfriends was one of the girlfriends of one of the leading mafia bosses in the early 1960s. So there are a lot of people who didn't want to find out really what happened. But I think what's fascinating is the Warren Commission does come out, and after that you do get this decline. And I think one of the problems is actually the assassinations around Kennedy and the conspiracy theories have been all wrapped into this one, and you've got this big blob of kind of QAnon and everything. There are real legitimate questions that still aren't really answered about Kennedy and his assassination, and those are legitimate areas of inquiry. They're not kind of QAnon madness. I think there are some questions that still need to be answered.
Nick, given what you've just pointed out about the fact that LBJ was in many ways a more consequential president than JFK following him, why is it that we're all so obsessed with JFK? Is it, I mean, if I was being cynical, I'd say he's good looking. He got shot. He got shot when the boomers were young, so he's very, very high in their consciousness. Is there a better reason than that why he looms so large in culture?
Oh, look, it was a staggeringly beautiful presidency, wasn't it? It was America's first telegenic presidency, really. I mean, this youthful president, 43 when he gets elected, I mean, he was a very good-looking guy. He had this beautiful wife, and this beautiful family. There was a style, a refinement, and a rationality about the Kennedy White House that was so different from the Eisenhower years, the somnolence of the Eisenhower years. There's this generational shift, and people love that kind of the torch has been handed to a new generation. How many people were inspired? I mean, my story, when I was a kid growing up, I was about 4 years old, there was this beautiful memorial in my home city in Britain. And it featured this very handsome young guy stood in front of this gold seal that looked like the Ark of the Covenant, addressing this richly multi-ethnic crowd. And later on, I realised that was Kennedy. The gold seal that looked like the Ark of the Covenant was the presidential seal. And the richly multi-ethnic crowd included Martin Luther King, which is a bit of a sort of playing with history. But I was really inspired by that. I was fascinated. And it was my gateway into a lifelong fascination with America. I was fixated by the Kennedy. It was only later that I realised there was this dark side of Camelot, and I started writing books that were critical. But I wonder how many people were like me. That was their gateway. The Kennedys were their gateway into a lifelong fascination and an inspiration, and a kind of... Because for so many people, Kennedy embodied America's best self. Its youth, its glamour, its style, its excitement, its sense of possibility, its sense of immigrant success. And I think that's part of the appeal of the Kennedy and why it endures today.
See, this is the difference between you and me. Your gateway was America at its best, JFK inspiring people. My gateway was the Clinton impeachment. That explains so much.
That was my professional gateway. I was a young Washington correspondent who arrived during that. And I've got to say, Chaz, I mean, one of the many analytical mistakes I've made over the last 20 years, I really thought that was going to be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. And, of course, I went on to cover 2 impeachments afterwards, both of them involving Donald Trump.
There was a sense that everybody after Kennedy was measured against Kennedy. And there are still echoes in, if Kennedy was the first Catholic president, Biden's the second. His hero growing up was Kennedy.
Yeah.
He quotes the poets, more Irish than Greeks and Tennyson, but he's Kennedy-esque, at least in his own mind. Do you see that there is still a kind of a Kennedy lingering influence on American politics?
Yeah, very much so. I think for years the Democratic primaries were a quadrennial search for the next Kennedy. He was the person everybody was judged against. And when people looked at Mike Dukakis, another Massachusetts guy who ran for the presidency in 1988, people thought, well, he's not John F. Kennedy, is he?
Good hair, very short.
Exactly. And I think that has become the yardstick. But it's really interesting to think historically. I mean, if all the polling of historians, for instance, they rarely put Kennedy in the top 10 presidents. I think that's a crucial point to make. I think the median over the past sort of 40 years is for him to be about 12 or 13. So it's rare that he actually breaks into the top 10. So the image of Kennedy is sort of more powerful in many ways than sort of substance of Kennedy.
Well, look, Nick, you know a lot more about JFK than I do, and I suspect all our viewers do. And I don't want any mythology anymore. We've had enough of that. So why don't you tell us JFK's real legacy?
Oh, look, I mean, Vietnam's a really interesting question. I mean, JFK Americanized the war, no question, but there are signs that in the final days of his life, in the final months of his life, he was questioning America's involvement in Vietnam. So he was certainly getting more dovish. Look, I think the very fact that we are sat here today having this conversation and the rest of the world is still alive. You know, you can trace back to the Cuban Missile Crisis and Kennedy's successful handling of that. I mean, many of the generals in the Joint Chiefs of Staff said we should be bombing the missile sites in Cuba. Kennedy said, let's not do that. He took a more dovish approach, which was to have a naval blockade, and he was right. If they'd bombed the sites, it might have led to nuclear Armageddon. There were people in the White House that day who really did not think they would live to see another weekend, including Robert McNamara, who was the Defence Secretary at the time. So that's a biggie, a really biggie, a mega biggie. And, you know, things like the moon landing. I mean, Kennedy challenged America to put a man on the moon and to bring him back safely. And they did it. I mean, the irony was that the weekend that they did it was also the weekend of Chappaquiddick, which is when Ted Kennedy drove off a bridge and a young campaign worker was died. So you had this, you know, a classic moment, the triumph of the tragedies of the Kennedys. It's a mixed legacy, but it's still a very powerful legacy.
Well, Nick Bryant, thank you for indulging our what-ifs and telling us a bit more about what was. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
It's great to be with you.
Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
Do you want a man for president who's seasoned through and through, but not so doggone seasoned that he won't try something new? A man who's old enough to know
And young enough to do.
well, it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you. Do you like a man who answers straight, a man who's always fair? We'll measure him against the others, and when you compare, you'll cast your vote for Kennedy, and a change that's overdue. So it's up to you, it's up to you, it's strictly up to you. Yes, it's Kennedy, 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 for me. Kennedy, 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 Kennedy.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
Yes, it is time for some malarkey chaz, some Kennedy-themed malarkey, no less. And as we are marking the 60th anniversary of the death of JFK this week, here are some of the reasons why his nephew, the independent presidential candidate Robert Kennedy Jr., is causing a whole lot of concern. He's getting about 20% in some head-to-head opinion polls against Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Nobody thinks he's going to be elected president, but crazier things have happened, for instance, in 2016. So, what is it about RFK that has so many people concerned? Well, for years and years and years, he was working as an environmental lawyer and an activist, and there was quite a lot of respect for him for a lot of those years. He'd brought his life back together after a 10-year heroin addiction disorder. Everyone thought this guy is a champion of the people, a male Erin Brockovich type. Then things started to get a little bit weird. He started questioning the safety of vaccines, and then he started repeating false and discredited claims that vaccines cause autism. Take a look.
Mercury has been removed from a lot of the vaccines, but there's aluminum in those vaccines, which, you know, operates along the same biological pathways and does the same kind of damage. It's extremely neurotoxic. And then there's other things, lots of other toxics in the vaccines that, you know, could be responsible. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of scientific studies that looks at it, but nobody ever reports them.
Nobody ever reports them because there literally are not hundreds and hundreds of scientific studies. They do not exist. There was one study that was published 25 years ago in the Lancet Medical Journal. It purported to show a link between vaccines and autism, but it has since been formally retracted. In fact, it has since been described by the British Medical Journal as, quote, an elaborate fraud. The bottom line is there is no scientific basis for the belief that vaccines cause autism. There isn't a conspiracy theory that Robert Kennedy Jr. doesn't entertain on some level, it seems. He's questioned the official version of 9/11. He says, well, I don't know what happened. But of course, in doing so, in saying there are doubts, he is again raising doubts about the truthfulness of the government and the media, official sources of information. Kennedy has repeated a conspiracy theory that COVID-19 was a, quote, genetically engineered bioweapon that may have been ethnically targeted to spare Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people, for example. Kennedy has made a pile of other unscientific, false and misleading, even ridiculous claims. He suggested that certain antidepressants are behind a rise in school shootings in the United States and that a particular herbicide might be part of why more young people are identifying as transgender. He's also stated that Wi-Fi radiation and 5G are dangerous and cause cancer, despite no good scientific or medical evidence that they do so. And he also thinks, interestingly, that the CIA killed his uncle, President John F. Kennedy.
There's a 60-year cover-up. The Warren Commission was run by Alan Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, who my uncle fired. Congress found that, yeah, it was a plot. It was a conspiracy. There were multiple people involved.
Oh, and by the way, if you're wondering about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s voice, we've talked about it before, he's got a nerve condition in his throat, which is why he talks like that. But he also thinks the CIA probably killed his father. So, with all that in mind, I've got a theory as well, which probably has a lot more science behind it than a lot of what Robert Kennedy Jr. says. And it could help us all understand what is going on with him and where all these conspiracy theories are coming from. Some psychologists believe, interestingly, that people affected by historical traumas tend to interpret current political events using conspiratorial framework. RFK Jr., of course, was 9 when his uncle was killed. He was 14 when his father was shot and killed in 1968. And he's now running for the job that one of them died holding and the other died seeking. So it's poignant. It would be cause for compassion as well, I suppose, were it not so dangerous, because there have already been real-world consequences from Kennedy's raising of doubts and peddling of misinformation. He helped to convince the government of American Samoa that the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine was dangerous. He visited the islands. After that, vaccine rates there fell. The next year, a traveller brought measles to the islands. The disease tore through the population. It sickened close to 6,000 people. It killed 83 people, most of them young children. Now, we can't say there is cause and effect there, but it didn't help. 4 of Kennedy's siblings have condemned his decision to run for president now, saying that Bobby might share the same name as our father, but he does not share the same values, vision or judgment, importantly. We denounce the candidacy and we believe it to be perilous for our country. In other words, his own family say that RFK Jr. is full of malarkey, and yet he has now got the platform of a presidential campaign, Chaz.
He does. Oh, I hate talking about RFK Jr.'s conspiracies because there are so many of them. And like you say, he does rack up a lot of them. But he doesn't make them up out of whole cloth. He doesn't, like with his conspiracies, they're not things like just completely just concocted out of the top of his head. He usually misinterprets scientific papers or misapplies them, or just like to try and fact check them is hard. Yeah. Because it's not on the surface obviously untrue. Like you need to look and look and look, and he's like he knows how to quote a scientific paper. So you think, oh, that sounds right.
It's a lawyer's trick. It's the same. He was able to give off-the-cuff medical evidence in his environmental trials, talking about the effects of aluminum on neural pathways, etc. He can be quite compelling as he does it.
And what that means is, because of the media world in which we live, people like glib, short, sharp, yes or no fact checks, which means fact checks often oversimplify what he said. And then people go, oh, that proves it's true. But it doesn't prove it's true. He lives in the grey. And I'll give you an example. I'll give you one example where I'm going through a million of them. I'll give you one example. Yep. You mentioned the COVID. The New York Post ran an article on him.
Ethnically targeted.
Yeah, ethnically targeted. There was a genetically engineered bioweapon that may have been ethnically targeted against Chinese and white people, I think it was, off the top of my head.
Yeah, blacks and whites favouring
that's right. Other way
Ashkenazi
around.
Jews and Chinese.
Sorry, yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, anyway. So this is what he said. This is what he said the day after. He said, the New York Post story is mistaken. I have never ever suggested that the COVID-19 virus was targeted to spare Jews. I accurately pointed out during an off-the-record conversation that the US and other governments are developing ethnically targeted bioweapons, and that a 2021 study of the COVID-19 virus shows that COVID-19 appears to disproportionately affect certain races, since the Furin-Cleve docking site is most compatible with blacks and Caucasians and least compatible with ethnic Chinese, Finns and Ashkenazi Jews. In that sense, it serves as a kind of proof of concept for ethnically targeted bioweapons. I do not believe and never implied that the ethnic effect was deliberately engineered. Okay, so did the New York Post misinterpret what he said? We've got the video. Let's have a look.
We've put hundreds of millions of dollars into ethnically targeted microbes. The Chinese have done the same thing. In fact, COVID-19, there's an argument that it is ethnically targeted. COVID-19 attacks certain races disproportionately. The races that are most immune to COVID-19 are because of the structure of the genetic structure, genetic differentials among different races of the receptors of the ACE2 receptor. COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and black people. The people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese. But we don't know whether it was deliberately targeted that or not. But there are papers out there that show the racial and ethnic differential impact to that.
Okay, so he definitely didn't say it was a genetically engineered bioweapon, but did he say it may ethnically target? It may have been ethnically targeting.
He said we don't know if it was deliberately targeted, but he'd already, and this is where the context is important, because he'd already said that, well, we know the Chinese are working on ethnically targeted bioweapons, and then a minute later he's, saying, well, we don't know. It's the raising of questions after raising the doubts. And these things in this sort of word salad side by side. It's a fairly Trumpy tactic as well. It's along Trump's sort of line of saying, well, people are saying, I don't know, but you hear this all the time. Robert Kennedy Jr. It's very much the same thing as, well, there are questions about it. Well, who knows what really happened on 9/11? It's the same kind of ploy.
Well, yeah. I don't think he's exactly the same as Trump, but I do agree that. This is what I was talking about before. He lives in the grey. Like if you look word by word at what he
helps
says,
create the grey.
Yeah, sure. But I'm just saying that word for word, what the New York Post said may not be 100% accurate with what he said. But there is no doubt that he, regardless of what he intended, he created with what he said, in the minds of some people,
right,
the thing which he may or may not have been trying to.
The President of the United States, or somebody aspiring to be President of the United States, has to be incredibly careful with their language.
Yes.
So again, to go back to Trump, when Trump was saying, well, possibly injecting bleach could help with COVID-19. Reckless, stupid thing to say, and potentially very dangerous. Kennedy is doing kind of the same thing. He is speculating on matters of medical science that he is not qualified as a lawyer to be speculating upon, and certainly not in public, using the bully pulpit of the presidency or a presidential candidacy.
By the way, when I was fact-checking that a few months back, I looked at the paper. He completely misinterpreted it as well.
Right.
I mean, it's based on a real paper, but he completely got it wrong.
Yeah.
So, which is kind of annoying as well. I was going to say that my major concern, what you're saying I agree with about the danger of someone who's just this loose. But I think the main problem with him, for people who are thinking about Robert F. Kennedy, is he's equally loose with his actual policies. Like he doesn't need to talk about this. He doesn't need to talk about vaccines or whatever. But he does need to talk about health policy. He does need to talk about economic policy if he wants to be president. His health policy is just as loose. Have a look at this.
I'm going to identify what's causing chronic disease and eliminate those exposures. And then, then we go back in 1960 when we had 6% chronic disease and we were paying 1/20th for our health care that we are today. Those costs, is eliminating chronic disease are going to make those costs drop.
So you don't, you're not a Medicare for all guy?
Well, my choice would be Medicare for all.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but not immediately. I think you need a private
like something like
option.
Australia?
Well, I don't know, what country I would model after, but I think that Medicare for all ought to be available for people, and with public-private options available as well. If you want to go to private insurer for, concierge service or whatever, that you can do that and give people as much freedom as possible.
And he goes on, but basically he's saying his healthcare policy is public healthcare, but also potentially private healthcare. In what way, not quite sure. Based on what country, not quite sure. When, don't really know. But on top of that, he's going to find out the causes of all chronic diseases and solve them, and then that will make the whole thing a lot cheaper. This is not a serious healthcare policy. And if you look at all his policies, they're the same. No thought, loose, all over the place. And if you want a president, yeah, we'd love to have a president that doesn't spread conspiracy theories, but I'd also love to have a president who actually has thought about any of his policies.
But also that he has this tendency to think that he's the one who can figure it out.
Yeah.
Solve chronic disease, fix Medicare for all, make it affordable. I mean, the way that he thinks, and again, I think it is very much explained by the trauma he suffered in childhood, trying to figure out what on earth has happened to his dad, his uncle, his family. I mean, you can see how he got to this point, but the fact that he has taken the Kennedy name and turned it into this campaign is disappointing to some.
Yeah, I don't think he's maligned. I just don't think he should be president.
Yeah, indeed. Well, for another perspective on the legacy of John F. Kennedy and the legacy which now includes, of course, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., we'll talk now to Bob Shrum. He's a legend of campaign politics in the United States. He worked for presidential candidates from Ed Muskie in '72 to John Kerry in 2004. None of them won, though. He's also worked very closely over the years with Senator Ted Kennedy, including Ted Kennedy's 1980 presidential campaign. Bob Shrum was a 20-year-old student at Georgetown University on November 22nd, 1963. But why would you say that President Kennedy's death meant so much to so many people, particularly there in the United States?
Well, at the time, it was the sense of a shattered hope. He inspired the country in so many different ways. He inspired a generation of activism. He told people that politics could be an honorable profession, and he seemed to demonstrate that by his own conduct. I think in retrospect, if you look back, it's very possible, indeed probably likely, that there would not have been, for example, a Vietnam War had he not been killed. It would have taken longer to pass the Civil Rights Bill. It would have taken longer to pass the tax cut, although I think ultimately they would have passed, certainly after he was reelected in 1964, and I think he would have been. You have to remember, I think on the day he died, his approval rating in the country was about 60%, and outside the South, it was about 72%.
And what do you think of those hypotheticals, those counterfactuals? Do you think that the United States, and indeed the world, would be a very different place had President Kennedy not died on that day?
Oh, yes. I mean, if there had been no Vietnam War, for example, America would have been so much better off. President Kennedy was also interested, by the way, in trying to pursue an opening to China, but was very worried about the political repercussions of that. I think that would have, I don't know whether that would have happened while he was president, but I think eventually we would have gotten there. But in so many ways, in terms of people's trust in government, trust in the democracy, trust in our institutions, we would have been much better off.
Bob, of course, in the following years, you knew and worked very closely with a number of members of the Kennedy family, including Senator Edward Kennedy, for a long period of time. How would you say that JFK's death affected those other members of the family and their careers and their political ambitions as well? Well,
you know, if President Kennedy had lived, I don't think Robert Kennedy would have been assassinated in 1968. I think that, you know, that very great reluctance to talk about it on the part of other members of the family. It was, you know, it was just a very hard thing. I mean, when Senator Edward Kennedy spoke to the 1980 Democratic Convention after he had challenged Jimmy Carter for the nomination, he did allude to his brothers, but he did it rather elliptically. In the words of Tennyson that my brothers so often quoted and loved.
I am a part of all that I have met. Too much is taken, much abides. That which we are, we are. For all those whose cares have been our concern, the work goes on, the cause endures, the hope still lives, and the dream shall never die.
I think in both the case of Robert Kennedy and Edward Kennedy, and Eunice Kennedy Shriver, by the way, who founded the Special Olympics with her husband, Sarge Shriver, I think there was a very strong feeling that they had to carry on that legacy. And that's why, in some ways, Edward Kennedy became probably the most productive senator of the last 100 years in terms of the range of social legislation that he passed. You know, when he endorsed Barack Obama, for president, which was a critical moment in the Obama campaign. He got Obama to promise that he would pursue national health reform, which he did, and it passed. And so in a way, the last piece of legislation that Edward Kennedy was responsible for passed and was signed into law after he had died.
And Bob Shrum, I wonder what you think of the enduring potency of the Kennedy name, the Kennedy brand in American politics. And I guess the question as well as to whether Robert F. Kennedy Jr. running for president next year, how much of his support, which is up to 20% in some polls, is down to the fact, quite simply, that he is a Kennedy.
Well, that's obviously the case. And as people get to know more about him, you'll see those numbers go down. There are a lot of people in his own family who have denounced him or denounced the decision for him to run for the presidency this year.
When you look at Robert Kennedy Jr., are you just concerned about his policies and his anti-scientific comments, or do you feel any sympathy for him as somebody who endured significant childhood trauma with the loss of his father and his uncle, his own addictions and so on? Do you feel compassion for him on that level?
Well, I feel sympathy for everyone who in that family who had to endure those assassinations. But Robert Kennedy is someone who's written a book saying that Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci were pushing vaccines in order to make a profit. I mean, that's just one of the things that he said. So I don't have any sympathy for his ideas, and I have no sympathy for his candidacy.
What do you make of the comparisons that are made between President Kennedy and President Biden, the first and second Catholics to become president of the United States? Joe Biden often talks about JFK as being his political hero, his inspiration. Do you see any similarities there? What do you make of those comparisons?
Well, look, everybody or many people who are Joe Biden's age, and I resemble that, were inspired to public service or to go into politics because of John F. Kennedy. So I don't find that surprising at all. You know, it's a little known fact, but one of the presidents that Ronald Reagan used to quote most frequently was JFK.
And is there anything, Bob, do you think that America's oldest ever elected president, Joe Biden, can learn from America's youngest ever elected president in John F. Kennedy?
Well, I think it's part of the fabric of the lives of people who are of that age. And I think he's proved to be a very, very successful, resourceful leader. His problem right now is that economic reality and economic perception are in two different places. And it takes 6 to 9 months for the perception to catch up with the reality. But, you know, the polling that he has right now is not something that I think tells us very much about what's going to happen in November of 2024.
Finally, Bob, do you sense that there is still a yearning for, if not another Kennedy to be president, a Kennedy-like figure? Or is all of that more about nostalgia now and a yearning for a lost past?
Well, I don't think it's nostalgia for a lost past, but you have to remember a very large percentage of the American population was not born at the time when John F. Kennedy was president and when he was killed. I think if another figure like that came along, he or she would be a most formidable presidential candidate. I think he had a capacity to connect with people. He had a resonance with American ideals, and he could motivate people in a way that I think if someone had those qualities, and even if they were only 43 years old, he was the youngest person ever elected president, I think they would do very well.
And that is it for another Fireside Chat. We will see you for Planet America Wednesday night, 9:30 p.m. on ABC TV.
Both shows are on the ABC iView, Facebook and YouTube whenever you like, and you'll find the Pep Podcast in all the very finest pod places there.
Good night.